As just a bit of a disclaimer for today's tutorial, the way that I recorded it with the window capture, none of the pop-ups or the tabs actually displayed. So there shouldn't be too much confusion because I go over and explain what I'm doing, but a lot of the time it's going to be me typing into an invisible tab or window, and then nodes are just going to be magically appearing. So I just wanted to make that disclaimer before anybody starts questioning where I'm getting these nodes and all these tabs from and where I'm reading these things from. So without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. So I've just gone up and I've created a new substance at 2048 by 2048 as well as relative to parent so that we can change the size whenever we want. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Materials, Default, and Edit. And I'm just going to come over to our Properties tab here, and I'm just going to make sure to set our scale up to 1. And that way, whenever we do any height changes, we're going to be able to see it on our 3D object here. So if we go down into our graph editor here, first things first, I want to create a base material, which I'm going to be plugging in all of my nodes to so that we can see it on the 3D object here. This kind of as a rough draft or a base to start off with. So in our parameters, I'm going to come down and I'm going to set it to dielectric. And then I want to make sure that I can plug in my normal and my height maps here, and we'll get some inputs on the left side of our base material node. So if we right click this guy and we view in 3D, now we're going to be able to see the result of our base material here. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I just add a normal map here, and we just plug that guy in, and it's going to get rid of any artifacting or any errors that we get. So we're going to get this nice smooth sphere. And to get this sphere instead of your base cube is we just go up to Scene and we hit Sphere. So I want to start off by creating the fiber fabric for the pincushion, the little tiny threads that you see if you were to hold it up close and take a look. And so how we're going to go about doing that is we're going to add a fibers to, and we get this tiling effect of some, rope looking spools here. And so I'm going to go down into its parameters, and I'm going to bump it up to around 33 because it gives us something pretty dense, something like that. And I'll just plug these guys in. And the first thing we're going to notice is that our height information, because we've set the scale to 1, it's pretty sharp. So we're getting some very drastic looking results here. So on the end of our height, right before we plug it in, I'm going to make sure I add a levels node. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take our black output here, and I'm just going to crank that guy really far up towards the white. So we get a very, very subtle height map here. And you can see it's not very deep, or it's not as deep as it was just prior to cranking up our black output here. And so I'm just going to move this guy over, and I'm going to click away from our node so that we don't have anything selected. And I'm just going to create a safe transform grayscale node. And now what this guy does, if you've ever used a transformation 2D, it's essentially the same thing. However, with a transformation 2D, you can really skew your materials. If we take a look, let's say we set this to something like 300. And we'll say maybe we'll set this to 50. And it looks interesting. It doesn't really tile perfectly, as you can see. And then if I were to click away and say I'm working over here and I want to come back and work on this, everything's reset. And so it's not really conducive to a workflow that allows you to go back and edit something later, because you're kind of set in stone when you use a transformation 2D. So it was brought to my attention that I should be using these safe transforms, because if we plug this guy in, you can take a look and see that some of the parameters are a little bit different, but we get relatively the same effect. We're able to tile it, which is basically just the scaling. So if we zoom in here, you can see that we are basically scaling it down or scaling it up. And we've also got rotation. And the nice thing about this rotation is that it is seamless. If we go across here, you can see that from one image to the other, or one texture set to the other, it actually interlocks and it's seamless. So from now on, I'm going to start using the safe transform, because it's just a safer bet when you're making materials, and it's going to keep you from being frustrated later down the line. That being said, I'm still going to use Transformation 2D for a few quick fixes now and then, but for the most part, we're going to stick with Safe Transform. So I'm going to bring this guy down here, and I'm going to rotate it at 90 degrees. So you can see that we've got these fibers going from left to right, but we've got these fibers going up and down. And so what we're going to do with that is we're going to create a blend. I'm going to plug the Safe Transform into our background here. And I'm going to plug our left and right one into our foreground. And so with our blend selected, I'm going to come into our blending mode, and I'm going to hit max lighten. And now you can see that's going to basically give us both of our fibers here going up and down and left to right, and we're going to get these little tiny divots, or these little holes or knots in our material. And so if I plug these guys in, it's starting to look a little bit more interesting, like it's interlocking fabric, but it's still not looking too great. And so what I'm going to do in order to fix that is kind of go against what I said just 2 seconds earlier, and we're going to use a Transformation 2D. And the reason that we're going to use a Transformation 2D is we are going to come down here and just have the scale of our material, because with the Safe Transform, it tiles it, and in my testing, it tiled it not how I really wanted it, so we just got a better result with our Transformation 2D. Again, it's give and take between these two nodes here. The safe bet is always to go with the Safe Transform. So that aside, we'll go down into our Transformation 2D here, and we're just going to have our material, and then I'm also going to come down to our rotation or our angle here, and I'm going to rotate it at a 45-degree angle. So now we've kind of got this sloping looking fabric, and now it's starting to come together and look a little bit more like a finer thread, or like something that's relatively squishy, or something that's soft. And so the last thing that I want to do for our fabric here is I want to make sure that we're getting some actual protruding geometry, because with a pincushion we've got those actual threads kind of wrapping over top around it and giving it that kind of squeezed effect. And so what we're going to do is we're going to, on top of our transformation, add a make it tile node here, And so we're just going to play around with some of these parameters a little bit. So for our mask precision here, I'm just going to bump that up to something like 0.95. And then I want to decrease the width of the pattern, because if we zoom in here real close, and you can see when I play around with the width, we actually start to stretch our pattern. And if I stretch it really far this way, we get some banding. And you can see kind of along here the banding that we're going to get if we stretch it too large. I want to do the kind of inverse or the opposite of that and decrease it so much that the patterns don't actually meet. So if we instead decrease this down to something like 100, now we're going to get these kind of mid areas where you can still see the pattern is tiling across, but you get some gradients or some darker spots in between the patterns. I also want to come over and increase the height just to 300 so that we get a little bit of a straighter gradient in between. And now you can start to see that we're getting some areas where we're going to be putting our threads that are coming down from the top all the way down to the bottom of our pincushion here. And so now the next thing I want to do is I want to start by creating the threads that I'm going to be placing down in the middle of our protrusions. So I'm going to come up over top of our fabric, and I'm going to type in shape. And so I'm going to come into our shape here, and I'm going to bring the X down to 0.09. And so it's going to give me just a rectangle right down the middle of my texture here. And so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take our shape here, and I'm going to apply a blur, high quality grayscale on it. And so we're just going to get a little bit of that beveling effect. And I'll say something like 14 will be good. And then I'm going to add a levels over top just to clear up the kind of really blurry or gradiated edges, because I just want to make sure that we get a sharp fall off. And we'll leave the white value and just bring the black up slightly just so that there's a subtle difference, but we're not getting that kind of edge glow around our rectangle here. And so I want to take this guy and I want to run him through a safe transform, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to bump up our X offset here to 0.5, making sure that our tiling is on by default so that we get our thread being half on both of our edges here. Because when we put it through a tile generator to go around our material here, it's going to line up perfectly right down the middle of our protrusions. So I add a tile generator on top of this guy and make sure to plug our output directly into our pattern input. We want to make sure that we come down to our pattern here, and we want to do image input. And so right now we've got it at X amount is 10 and Y amount is 10. And if we take a look, we're going to get really wacky results, and we don't want that. So I want to take the Y down to 1 because I only want there to be one of our images here tiling on the Y up and down. And for our X, I want to bump this down to 8, because if we go back down to our fabric here and take a look, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 for our edges. So all in all, we're going to need to have 8 threads lined across our material. So if we go back up take a look at this guy. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And this is why we needed to transform our shape here so that it's on the edges, because if we didn't, it wouldn't line up on our edges here. And if we take a look, and I just set this back to 1, you can see that it's going to transform across within our texture here. So by making sure that it is transformed on our X beforehand, now we're going to get the tiling along the edges that we need for our make it tile patch down here. So now that we've got the base geometry for our thread, I want to go in and I want to start making it actually look like we've got some stitching going on, because right now all it is just some white lines. So I'm going to go right beside, and I'm going to take a Fibers 2 again, and I'm going to really bring up the amount of fibers we've got, something to about, let's see, 25. We'll go with 25 for right now. And for this, I'm going to take a transformation 2D node as well. Again, taking this one instead of a safe transform, because what we're going to be doing is tilting this at a 45-degree angle. And if I take a safe transform to just compare, you can see that when we take this and we tilt it at a 45-degree, it also kind of decreases the size a little bit, which really isn't too much of an issue. And if we take a look at the tiling, again, you can see that our transformation 2D node does not line up. But in this particular circumstance, we don't need our texture to be seamless. And so I'm just going to go with the node that is the quickest to load. If we take a look, 0.8 milliseconds versus 0.63. So in this particular scenario, I'm going to choose a transformation 2D over a safe transform. So we'll just get rid of that guy. And zoom out over here. And now I'm going to blend these two together. So if I move our group, and I take these, and I create a blend, I'll put this guy over top and put this guy underneath. And then I'm going to change our blending mode to multiply. And you can see now it's taking the fibers of our Fibers 2 node here and going to multiply over top of the white bars, or the rectangles that we've created, essentially the threads. And so it's going to get rid of any white information of our fibers here and just keep any of the darker information. So we've effectively made ourselves some threads that we can also just increase or decrease the number of. So if we increase the tiling, we make it a lot tighter. And if we decrease the tiling, you can see it looks a lot more like stitches going straight up and down. And if we go right down to 3, they look more like slivers. So I'm going to go back up to around 30. I like that, and we will save. And so I'm going to, on top of this, create another blend and plug this guy into that, and plug this guy into that. And so I want to make sure that I set this to screen, because we want to get rid of any of the black values really on this guy here. And so now that we've got this plugged in, I'm actually going to take this guy and use him as our opacity as well. And on top of that, I'm going to plug in a levels node just so that we can get some nice precision And now you can see we've got some nice stitches or nice threads going down our protrusions here. And I'm going to plug these guys into our normal and our height just so we can see the effect that we're going to get. And it's looking pretty good. Now I think that the fabrics are still a little bit too large. So I'm going to come back up to our fibers up here. And I'm just going to crank it all the way up and see what we get. And something like that looks a lot nicer actually. As well, I just want to make sure that I go over here and I want to decrease the X size of our rectangles here because I think it's a little bit too large and we're not getting any of the kind of gradient that we had going. So I'm just going to decrease our X just a little bit. And something like that's looking pretty good. And so now that I've got my stitching or my threads on, I want to make it look like it's kind of being, you know, a little bit tugged and pulled around, kind of at the seams here, kind of like it's softer fabric and it's kind of like folding over itself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take our fabric group down there and I'm going to create a crease node. And you can see it already starts to kind of look like folded fabric. So we'll take this guy. I'm going to add a safe transform on it because I just want to rotate it negative 90 degrees so that we get this kind of creased looking effect all along our material here. And so on the end of our tile node, or our make it tile node, I'm going to add another blend. And I'm going to put this guy just up over top. And so you can see the effect that it's starting to take with just the crease node here. And if we go into our blending mode, we can hit add sub. And it's going to put it over top of the material that we have. Now, however, I don't like how it's got this huge effect on top of it, like it's kind of going across and being broken up by the threads here. It just doesn't really make too much sense. We want it to be a little bit, you know, smaller just around the edges of our threads here. As well, if we come in, you can see that some areas are really peaking white, and that's going to make our material look really flat in some areas. So how I'm going to go about doing that is I'm going to create a shape node kind of like what we did up here with our thread, except I'm going to create it so that we have our mask basically occluding any middle parts of our protrusions. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to add another shape node. And I'm just going to decrease it slightly on the X. I don't know how much, just because we don't know how big or how far into our protrusion we want our creases to go. So on top of that guy, I'm going to add a blur. And so on our blur, I'm also just going to add a safe transform, because we're going to do the same thing that we did for our thread, and that we're going to offset it so that it lines up perfectly on each of our threads here. So if I go down and I go to our X and just crank that up to 0.5, we also want to add a tile generator, and we want to make sure that we set our image input, bring our Y all the way down to 1, and like before, we just want to make sure that we're on 8 because we've got 8 individual protrusions in our texture. And so I'm going to find where we've got our blend between our crease and our fabric, And I'm going to take this guy and use this as the opacity. And if we take a look here, you can see that the white areas are going to show up with the creasing over top, but it's not going to show up in the middle. And so now I can play around with the X size of our shape to see how far into the protrusion I want to go. And something like that looks really good. Now, in order to fix the peaking, all I'm going to do is I'm going to take our opacity down a little bit. And so now we've just got some subtle creasing right along the edges and the areas that make the most sense. And so I've just cleaned up all the remaining nodes that we had, and I've gone ahead and just deleted the base material, and then I've plugged in our normal and our height to the outputs here. And just for sake of visualization here, I'm just going to come up top and I'm going to plug in a uniform color node. And I'm going to just convert it to grayscale for right now and just bump that up to a mid-gray or a mid-value so that we can see the geometry that we have here. As well, I'm going to plug in our base color here just in our roughness so that we don't get anything ridiculously glossy. So I'm going to start off by actually creating our albedo or our base color here by separating both the middle threads and the actual protrusion, tiny patterns that we've created, just by using each individual geometry and then masking it off. And so going about doing this is going to be relatively easy. So I'm going to drag in 2 uniform color nodes, and these are going to be the 2 differences in colors that we're going to show on our material. So the top uniform color I'm going to select, I'm going to make that just kind of a green for right now. Something like a nice middle to darker green. And then for our one on the bottom, I'm going to drag that and just make that guy, again, a bit of a mid to darker red. And we can switch these once we actually see them in our viewport here. And I'm going to blend those 2 together. So I'll take our red and put that in the background, because that's going to be, if we're thinking about background and foreground, the red is going to be encompassing our entire tomato. And if we took off these threads here, it would still be red underneath it. And we'll put our green on our foreground because, like I said, it's technically going over top of the geometry of the tomato. And so we've got a mask between the 2 materials here, just down with our thread mask that we used here when we wanted to blend them together. So if I just take this guy that we've used down here and plug him in, you can see now we're going to get the green coming down in the same areas that we have them coming down on our geometry here. And so if I just click and drag this guy into our base color now, you're going to see that we're starting to get some more intended results here. So now I'm just going to clean this up a little bit by dragging these guys over top. And now I'm going to drag back our normal map, because I'm going to use this as the base for our roughness map here. So if I just drag our uniform color down, and again our normal's back a little bit, I'm going to add a curvature smooth. And what this is going to do is it's going to take all of the edge geometry and edge information from our normal map here and basically just convert it into black and white. And so anything that is black or darker in value is going to be a lot shinier in a roughness map, and anything that's whiter is going to be a lot rough or less glossy. And it's inversely in a glossiness map, where anything that's white will be glossy and anything that is black will be rougher. So just because we've got a roughness output right here, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this and put it through a levels node so that we have more control over our grayscale information, but also because the way that we have it right now doesn't make a lot of sense, because along the edges here, right in the kind of crevices of our material, we've got it technically being the glossiest part of the entire material here, and that doesn't really make a lot of sense just physically on our mesh. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I have my levels selected, and I'm going to invert the white and the black inputs. So now the whiter areas along the kind of recluded areas are going to be a lot rougher, and the areas on top that see more of the light and catch more of the rays is going to be glossier. So now I'm just going to go ahead and plug this guy in, and you can see that we're catching a little bit of sun on the tops of our material here, and then if we crank up the white, we slowly start to take away, and if we increase the contrast between the two, now you can really see it's breathing life into our material here. And so we get something that's a little bit shiny, but I kind of like the look that it's giving it. And again, it's all about playing around with your roughness map to really get the look that you're going for here. And so for our metallic input, or our output, because none of this material is actually metallic, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a uniform color node, and I'm going to plug that guy in. I want to make sure that this uniform color is grayscale, because this output is a grayscale output, meaning it's going to only accept grayscale information, or when it gets color information, it's going to output it as grayscale. So we'll just make sure to save ourselves any hassle and commit that to grayscale. But I also want to avoid using any resources that we don't really need. And what I mean by that is we've got our texture right now as a 2K texture, but it's just a black color. We can actually kind of circumvent that and make it so that every time we load this material, it's not loading a 2K texture for this single color. So to do that, we have to go up to our output size here, and we want to make sure we just click on this little tab right here, and we want to set that to absolute. So now no matter where we open this material or this graph, it's going to be a specific size no matter what. And so now we've got it set to 256 by 256. But we can actually bring that down to just 16 by 16 pixels here. And so now you can see it's drastically reduced our load time from 0.8 milliseconds to 0.06 milliseconds. And you can see it's a really tiny texture set here, because it's only 16 pixels by 16 pixels. And so now down for our height, we've just got it running through a levels node currently. And because for this material, I didn't really have it have too much height, we don't really need to change this too much, because if you take a look at a Pincushion, there isn't really a lot of height information that you can really get just with your threads and your fabric here. But if you play around with your inputs and your outputs, you'll be able to get some different results here. But overall for this material, I'm just going to leave that. So now we want to add one more output of our own, and that's going to be ambient occlusion, so that we can start to get some more shadowing detail on the insides of our threads and inside the little recesses. So in order to do that, we just want to type in output, and I'm going to line that guy up. And we want to come over to its parameters, and we want to change the usage to ambient occlusion down in here. We also want to make sure that we just label everything so that we are able to find it later on. And we want to make sure that we add it to the material group, because that helps us when using the node in a different graph later down the line, and connecting all of our sockets is just made that much easier if we add everything to a material group. And so now that we've got that, I'm going to add an ambient occlusion node. And I'm going to take our height information that we blended together between our threads and our creases and our fabric here, and I'm going to plug that guy into our ambient occlusion. So now we're going to get some really, really harsh detail, because our height depth is set way too high for how shallow this material really is. I also want to make sure that I have GPU optimization on, just so that I'm using the power of my GPU to drastically reduce the draw call time of our node here. And if I zoom in, I just want to find some crease areas, and I want to bring the height depth down just a little bit so that we're not, cranked up, and now we don't get any information about our threads here, because we've just got all shadow detail. So if I bring this way back down and play around with the radius a little bit, something like that looks interesting. And again, playing with samples increases or decreases the quality of your render here, or of your node. I'm going to leave that on 8 samples for now, because it's the middle quality. And I'm going to plug this in. Now, to view this in our 3D, we have to right-click anywhere in our graph, and we have to go to View Outputs in 3D. And now we're getting our ambient occlusion affecting our geometry here, or at least the specularity and albedo. So now when we play around with our ambient occlusion, we're going to see the effects that it has over top. And you can see what happens when we crank it up. It looks like we've got almost an endless pit of just how deep the recesses are, and that doesn't look right, because as we all know, a pincushion is never that deep. It's a pretty shallow surface level. So we're going to just bump that right down, just to give us some indication that there is shadow, but not a lot. It's a very, very subtle effect. You never really want your ambient occlusion to be pitch black or overbearing, because it starts to look really wrong and it doesn't make sense. So in this first tutorial, we covered how we created the tomato pincushion material, and in the next two in the series, we're going to cover how we create a cactus version of the pincushion, and how we go about achieving a semi-realistic, semi-cartoon yarn ball. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and keep on learning. We'll see you in the next two tutorials.